Well, we're going to start a new trek through Scripture, and we're going to take some stops along the way, and we're going to pause along the way as well. But we're going to start by going in reverse, okay? Which I always like doing things kind of backwards. If you ever know, you know. Guys, right? We do almost everything backwards. They say, here's a bookshelf. And you go, I don't need no stinking instructions. Anybody? I did that to a shelf at my mom's house, and I put it all together, and I'm like, Mom, you bought a faulty bookshelf, and I would press on the end, and it would teeter back and forth, and then my friend comes in and goes, dude, it's because you put it together wrong, and I'm like, blasphemy. And he showed me the directions, and I'm like, you're not a real man. And I shoved the directions back in his face. He did it by the directions, and guess what? It worked. But he also did something wrong, so I got to rub it in his face a little bit, which was kind of fun for me. But anyway, we're going to start a trek through the Old Testament and through the prophets. And we're going to start by looking at Malachi. So if you have your Bibles today, please turn to Malachi. If you don't know where that is, go to Matthew and go back one book. Okay? Really simple. That's kind of why I like starting backwards. Plus, we know the gospel, we understand the gospel, and now we can see what the prophets were saying and how they line up with what the Gospels are preaching and teaching. And it's really fun. So we're going to be in Malachi today. And I really had a hard time this week as I kept studying and putting in a note and things like that to not spell Micah. So Micah, you were on my mind a lot this week. I don't know why, but it wasn't you. It was the book. So sorry, man. Don't want to ruin that for anybody. I just got a small thing I need to say. For anybody that helped with Pastor Bill's funeral yesterday, I want to say a huge thank you. Without you, you would have seen me running around here like a chicken with my head cut off, freaking out and worrying over stuff that I didn't need to. So if you helped in any single way, I want to say thank you. And if you see Aiden, give Aiden a high five and a thank you as well Micah. They helped get a good portion of the chairs in the building. They helped set everything up. Aiden and I both had some knee nicks from weed whacking outside, and it was just a good time that we got to have hanging out with each other and just preparing for that. But I wanted to say thank you first and foremost. But as we look to Malachi, we need to understand some things, and I want to just open up a little bit of the background of what was going on. So Malachi is to have lived during the same time as Ezra and Nehemiah, around 460 BC. And his name in general means my messenger. So his fellow Israelites were guilty of corrupt worship and unethical behavior, and thus he called them to a renewed covenant obedience. That is the main purpose of what we're going to find out through the book and through the prophet's message. Now, Malachi's ministry took place nearly 100 years after the decree of Cyrus in 538 BC, which ended the Babylonian captivity and allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple, as we see in 2 Chronicles. This was some 80 years after Haggai and Zechariah encouraged the rebuilding of the temple. Those two earlier prophets had said that the rebuilding of the temple would result in peace, prosperity, the conversion of people from other nations, and a return of God's own glorious presence. Wow. Just 80 years later, and Malachi's going to be talking about some. To the scourge of the people of Malachi's day, these predictions must have seemed a cruel mockery. Because see, just 80 years after those words were spoken, the people of Malachi's day weren't seeing it. Like, we don't see prosperity. We don't see any of these other things. And how bad that must have looked in their eyes. See, when I was growing up, there was this big movement of name it and claim it and prosperity theology, where when you gave your life to Christ, everything became glitter and rainbows. And I have to say that was very far from true. When you give your life to Christ, you're giving your life over to be like Christ. Which means if he got whipped, spit on, and beat on, guess what? We should expect to get whipped on, beat on, and spit on. Now, hopefully none of us have to go through that. Hopefully that is not the case. But we should not go through life thinking it's all going to be unicorns and glitter sparkles. So the people of Malachi's day must have thought it was cruel mockery. And I know just as like I have in my past, and many have in their past before me, when you go through hard stuff, you sometimes question God's faith, right? You question who God is in your life. You go, how could a good God really love me if he's allowing all this hate and hurt to go on in my life? And it must seem cruel. But in contrast to the growing promises, they faced economic difficulties due to drought and crop failure. They remained an insignificant territory, no longer an independent nation and no longer ruled by a Davidic king. Worst of all, despite the promises of God's presence, they experienced only spiritual decline. Look around today. The church is facing a huge spiritual decline. Maybe not here, maybe not in churches around us, but all throughout the nation of America, the church is facing severe spiritual decline. New Age is wiggling its way in. Prosperity gospel is still there. You have other religions popping up all over the place. You have different beliefs of like, well, I don't believe that. Well, guess what? If the word says it, I don't care about your opinion. And just like in that day, I can kind of see some similarities within the church. I found it interesting, and this is just a little snippet outside of the message. This un-Davidic king that came along, which would be very interesting, would set the very foundation of this attempt on the Messiah's life. And Malachi is going to bring up Jacob and Esau, which one would become Israel, the other would become the Edomites, however you want to pronounce it. And within that grouping of people, we all, for the most part, know the story. Jacob was making a red stew, and Esau was really hungry, right? And Esau was first. And he comes up, and Jacob goes, trade me your birthright, and I'll give you some red soup. And he's like, okay, deal, and gives him the red soup, and then he walks away, and he's mad because he lost his birthright for a thing of soup. And then later on, Jacob tricks his father and ends up getting the blessing of that which was supposed to be on the birthrighted child, which would have been Esau. And gets the good blessing, and then Esau comes in and is like, what the heck? Give me a blessing. And Isaac goes, okay, I'll give you one. You're going to serve your brother. I'm going to serve my younger brother. That's not going to be great, right? And so all this is going on, and so there's some animosity, just like you would expect, between brothers. And as Scripture will tell us in Romans, it actually quotes part of Malachi and talks about how, hey, Jacob I loved, and Esau I hated. And how oftentimes we go, well, if God's a God of love, how can he love one and hate the other? Well, we're going to explain that in a little while. But what is interesting is out of Esau eventually comes Herod the Great, who's an Edomite. And out of that, he would go after and pursue the Messiah, not to get the people closer to him, but to kill him, to stop the prophecy. And it's interesting because it only takes 400 years after Malachi does this happen. Back to Malachi. So within the book of Malachi, there are 6 different disputes between God and Israel. And there is a common pattern to each dispute. Here's just a little pattern that we can look for and keep watching for as we go throughout the book. First, God charges his people with bad behavior. So God's going to say, you've been bad, and this is how. Then he envisages the people's response to the charge. Okay, so he charges them, and then you get the people's dispute. But you say. And third, God then replies to their presumed response and expands the charge. So let's start in Malachi verse 1. And we're only going to go through 5 verses this morning. And it reads, "The oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi." Pretty simple. This is what the Lord's going to say through Malachi. But I want to take a step back, because that word oracle, a lot of times in our English language and how things have changed, we sit back and we're like, oh, that's a mysterious word, right? Apparently he went into this thing and was like, oracle, speak to me. And it was like, right? And you have all this smoke and this weird stuff. And then something speaks out of nowhere and he goes, oh, and then he goes out and he shares it, right? That's not what this oracle is. The definition of the word in its simplicity is that this is a message message from God that is weighty. So what Malachi is going to say, it holds weight. There's some pressure there. This is something where if Malachi would have kept that inside of him and not said anything, it would have, right? You crumple under that pressure. But when he releases it and speaks it out, the weight is taken off. It is one of importance and in a loving nature, even though it may be harsh. Just like a parent gets after their kid, it might sound harsh to the kid, but it's because you love them. God's looking at his people and say, hey, I have this to say about you very, very harshly. But it's because I love you. It's a message to God's people. Now, this first dispute or argument is one of a defense of God's love. Verse 2. This is God speaking through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, how have you loved us? Is not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob. See, God's people at the time were sitting back, and while God was saying, I love you, I love you, I love you, let me show you how much I love you, they stand back and be like, how? How have you loved us? Look, we were just gotten in captivity. Look, we just got taken out of this. Look, it's still hard. All these promises that you made 80 years ago, where are they? You know, one can get very, very bitter when you don't step back and actually look at God and say, God, I can see you moving. Share a small story with you about my cousin Caleb. My cousin Caleb is hearing impaired. He's not legally deaf in the same sense of that he was born deaf. But he is deaf in the fact that he had a bone that was growing out of his ear hole. Okay? And they had to shave that down and shave it off. And he has a cochlear on one side and he has a hearing aid on the other. And he couldn't hear for a lot of our life, which made life hard. A big barreling kid can't hear very well. And my aunt and uncle heard very clearly, don't worry about it. God is going to take care of it. Caleb will hear. Now we could step back and say, hey, unless that's a miraculous, like all of a sudden his ears are 100% working right, we could all stand back and be like, anything God does outside of that is null and void. That's not God, that's man trying to be God, right? I've heard that. I've heard that before. Now my aunt and uncle could have done one or two things. What they did was trust in God. What they could have done is question God and say, well, how's that supposed to happen? How are you going to make that work? How are you going to do this, God? How are you going to do that? Why don't you just shut up and trust him, right? Right? And so they did. They leaned into it and they says, okay, God, however you're going to have this happen, we don't care if it's through hearing aids, through cochlears, it doesn't matter. We know that you're going to have him here at some point in his life. Please let us just be there to see it happen. Now, my uncle took a job and actually took a pay cut to work at a college as a maintenance man. And as being a part of that maintenance package, come to find out his insurance covered cochlear implants. And they say, okay, Lord, if this is you, please make it happen. All of a sudden, Caleb was on a waiting list, and all of a sudden, he got jumped to the top. And within that waiting list, they sit down with the cochlear implant people and they hear all the speech and everything that it is, and then they're handed the bill, and they look down at the bill and they say, Lord, I don't know how you're going to do this because we can't. Because each ear is $80,000 at that point. The college and his insurance covered all but $800 per ear. That's a lot of money. So $160,000 covered all but $800. So all of $1,600, that's what, $146,000? I think I'm close. That their insurance covered for 2 ears cochlear implants. My cousin could hear today. Is it the best? Not the greatest, but we're still trusting that he's going to step up and get the other side done at some point. But it's cool because they just leaned into it and says, God, however you're going to do it, we're just going to simply stand back and let you do it. There was no searching, there was no questioning him. Now at times they had, but ultimately they submitted that to God and says, God, not our will, but your will. Not our ways, but your ways. And the people of Israel at this point in time were standing around going, but when has God showed us that he loved us? You know what I call that? Being a pessimist. It's funny, I saw this cartoon that talks about some people see a glass half full and some people see it half empty. And depending on what side you are, you either are really happy or you're really sad. But there is one thing to know. If you would take the third side and realize that, hey, the cup just needs to be filled up, right? And it changes depending on what the cup is, right? Some people say, oh, if it's a cup of water, then you're okay. Some would say, if you see half a cup of blood, pour it out, because that person might need that blood, right? Either way, sorry, that's just me making a joke. But see, Malachi is speaking to God's people who had at this time given in to this false worship and held contempt for God. They're saying, because we don't see and we don't agree and we don't think God is loving to us, we're going to believe these other things. We're going to go do our own thing. They were bitter towards God, so what did they do? They opened up their bitterness for other things to grow and to live. Yet God was reminding them, I have loved you. They had not love for God as he desired, or as they desired, because they did not feel as if they were loved by him. It's interesting, too, because I see that within context of our own culture, a lot of times we do things by feeling, right? I like the Broncos because it makes me feel good. Not all the time, okay? I understand. Before Mahomes, I felt really great. There are things that we do in our life that make us feel good, right? Eating fried chicken on a hot day makes me feel good, right? Going to the gym and sitting in the hot tub. You all thought I was going to say working out. No. Going to the gym and sitting in the hot tub makes you feel good, right? Doing something nice for someone else makes you feel good. Being a good person should make you feel good. But like a lot of things, we should not rely our relationship with God on our feelings, because our feelings lie to us all the time. I felt like we were a Super Bowl winning team years ago. Shouldn't have trusted it. Okay? Russ was not the answer. Okay? We shouldn't trust our feelings like, yeah, is fried chicken delicious? Yes. But you eat too much, it's not good for you. It's not. Sitting in the hot tub, you're going to get all pruny and you're going to get disgusting. Leaning on your own personal desires and your wants, you're not going to live a life that is all that great. I want to shake you just a little bit, okay? If you don't put your trust and your faith in a God that loves and cares for you, whatever you have here on earth is the best it's ever going to get. And I'm sorry to say, I've seen some of your lives and I've seen some of your pasts and your histories. Those ain't that great of things. Right? My life would be horrible because this is about the best I've ever been. And even this ain't that great in compared to what he's got for me. Their love was not in God. Yet Israel, oftentimes, and we see it throughout the history of Israel itself, they always come back to that question. No, you didn't. Nuh-uh, we don't see that. We want better food than just this bread from heaven. Fine, I'll send you quail. Well, we don't want to do that. We just take us back to Egypt. What? Even here, they're getting closer and closer to the Messiah coming. They don't even recognize that, and they're simply going, how can you say that you love us? Because we don't see it. We can't base our whole trust in God based on how he makes us feel. We need to draw to him because of who he is. Now they ask that question, how have you loved us? And he responds, it's not Esau, Jacob's brother. Now it's interesting because to the Jews they would have understood who Esau was. And they look back on Esau's history and be like, God, how can you say that you love us? Look at the history of Esau. Esau was not given the best of anything. But guess what? Esau still prospered. Esau still grew. And not just Esau, but the people who Esau would be the father of, the Edomites. They had things. They had power. They had strength. They leaned all upon their own self. But when it came down to it, when the destruction of that nation came and they were going to be set into bondage, God protected Israel. Why? Because they leaned on God. What did the Edomites lean on? Themselves, their strength, their power, their ability, their gods. They didn't trust God. And here God is going, it's like, look, I let it happen on both of you. You hear that saying? God reigns on the just and the unjust. Bad things happen to good people just as much as they happen to bad people. He still cared for him. He still loved him. But the protection came to Israel, not to Edom. God was upholding his covenant promise that he made with them. In Genesis, we see in Genesis 25:23, it speaks of how the older Esau will serve the younger Jacob. And God really brought that to be. Now we need to understand something, that the way in which God showed his love was that he showed a greater love for that of Israel than Edom. Yet he still loved them both. Through Israel, he gave his people his law, his church, his temple, his prophets. And just like that, he subjected Edom to the Israelites. The younger will serve, or the older will serve the younger. Carried out his plan and carried out what was said. But in the end, God gave both nations alike, both his people and not his people, over to the Chaldeans for the punishment of their sins. But the Jews he brought back. He brought back his people. God's love with him, or with that of Jacob, and in turn Israel, not that it wasn't with Esau, but as he had said, the older will serve the younger, and God's grace was going to be on and through Jacob. God's love was going to be shown to the Edomites that would turn to the way of Israel, to the way of following God, not themselves, in the way of giving their will over to God's will. And it's interesting. Verse 3, but Esau I have hated. I have laid waste his hill country and left his heritage to jackals of the desert. Now we must understand context, which is very important here. As Malachi and as well Paul speaks of Esau not as an individual person or state, but as a means of talking about their ancestry. See, Esau's line would produce the Edomites, who were not just a completely cursed people, as Genesis 33:9 shows us, and also 36. But see, the Edomites would become bitter enemies with Israel, God's chosen people, and thus their rejection was valid. This would show us then that God's hatred of them came not because of who they were, but because of their actions towards God's chosen people. See, God chose Jacob because he walked with him. He would talk with him. He put his trust in God. He was against Edomites because they were wholly and solely against God's people. They would come after, they would bring him down, and even in the story of Jacob and Esau, those two times where Jacob took advantage of Esau, and it showed that Esau had a strict and hard hatred for his brother. It's interesting. So it's not just because his name was Esau. It's not just because he was the weird dude that liked to hunt. It was simply because God knew what was going to take place. And you know the difference? God could have went eeny, meeny, miny, mo and picked one. We shouldn't care who he picked, other than the simple fact that he picked one to have his line go through. We need to align ourselves with that, because it's aligning then ourselves with God, with his plan and his desire. Verse 4, if Edom says we are shattered, but we will rebuild the ruins, the Lord of hosts says, they may build, but I will tear down, and they will be called the wicked country, and the people with whom the Lord is angry forever. You can rebuild. When you're a bad person, something bad happens, you can rebuild, right? Because you got no problem stabbing somebody in the back to get what you want. You have no problem lying about anything, right? I've been around some bad people that are actually really nice. And be like, oh, you're so right. And they build upon something that's just going to shatter, because God will not allow bad things to grow and to happen like that. He won't. Eventually, he's going to get his retribution. He's going to get his stuff back to his people. Case in point, look at Egypt. Egypt was this big, huge, strong power, right? And it was because a man of God walked in and God had placed him there to save his line. For those hundreds of years, Egypt grew because of the prosperity of the Jews being within their ranks. All of a sudden, Egypt gets outside of itself, and instead of trusting God's people, they started to use God's people and to build their own empire, to build their own godheads, to build their own temples, to build their own stuff. And eventually God said, I've had enough, and I'm going to free my people. And he sent Moses back into the nation to free his people. And as they're getting ready to leave, what does God do to the Israelites? The Jews get blessed with stuff from Egypt. The Egyptian people are so terrified of what's going on. They're giving them all the gold and all the linen and all the stuff that they need to then build the tabernacle in the woods, essentially. They're given all the stuff to do that by the Egyptians, who are terrified of them because they're God Israel. And they're like, hey, take this. Oh, by the way, hey, some of us want to go with you, by the way, because Egypt is horrible and you guys are much, much nicer. And we see the difference in God. And they would leave with him. And God took what Egypt had built, and said, guess what? You built this. You think you're all powerful. Guess what? I'm going to take it and give it right back to my people. And he sent them out into the desert. It's interesting how God works. I don't know why, and I don't know how a lot of times, but what I do know is I don't want to be on his bad side. I don't want to be on the side of God that says, hey, it's going to be bad for you. It's going to be horrible. So if Edom says, oh yeah, we will rebuild our ruins, the Lord of hosts says, they may be built, but I will tear it down. See, the Edomites did not worship or follow God alone. They worshiped pagan gods and worshiped fertility. Because they were close relatives of the Israelites, they were forbidden. Israel was forbidden from completely hating the Edomites. See this in Deuteronomy 23:7. However, the people of Esau would regularly attack the people of his brother. There were many wars fought because of it. King Saul fought against the Edomites, and King David subjugated them, establishing military garrisons in Edom with control over Edomite territory. Israel had access to port of Ezon-Geber on the Red Sea, from which King Solomon sent out many expeditions. And after the reign of Solomon, the Edomites revolted and had some freedom until they were subdued by Assyrians under, and I can't say his name, Tilgath-Pileser. And later on, during the Maccabean Wars, the Edomites would be subjected by the Jews and were forced to convert to Judaism. And they would maintain much of their old hatred for their Jewish brothers. It's interesting then when Rome would rise to power and to dominance, the Edomite was changed and called Edomenes. And with this came an Edomene whose father had converted to Judaism, was named King of Judea. That very king is known to history as King Herod the Great, the tyrant who ordered a massacre in Bethlehem in an attempt to kill the Christ child. God's anger then towards them was justified. It was justified. They came against God's people. So that should be a very good benefit for us who love Christ, for us who love God and want to walk with him. You don't got to take your vengeance. God's got your back. Don't worry about it. Just love him. But you need to understand that God has not called you then, just like he has called Israel to not hate Esau's people. We're not called to hate our enemies either. We're not. We're called to love Christ, to love God, to walk with him, to talk with him. As much as you have been forgiven, you have been called to forgive, which, by the way, is a lot for most of us. Not to hold on to that anger and let it fester, as Esau once did. Secondly, he's calling God's people to see. Verse 5, your own eyes shall see this, and you shall say, great is the Lord beyond the border of Israel. See, it's not enough that we just simply remember his love. We need to actually see it all around us. And part of that starts with you realizing just how loved you are. You're loved so much that your sin that should keep you from God, he died for it. It's perfect in Christ. Like when you come to realize that, when you get rid of your pride and you say, hey, you know what? I'm not that great. I'm not that good. My best is God's worst. When you realize that and you come to that point in your life where you go, you know what? Now that I step back and I look at my life from outside of my own opinions and my own thoughts and my own beliefs and my own education even, you start to realize how good God really is. That he put up with all your junk. He put up with all your garbage. He put up with all your doubts. He put up with all your hatred and anger towards him. And guess what? He's still up there saying, I love you. He still cares. And he still wants you to come to him. And as Malachi is standing there at the people saying, hey, listen, you are rebuking and you're angry towards God and you're saying, he has never loved us. How dare you say that? How dare you step back and look at everything he's done for you? Look at the fact that, yeah, you questioned him in the desert. And because of your 2 weeks of wandering and you're complaining and you're whining and you're bickering and you're simple going, they're too big, and listening to 10 people who did not have faith and trust in God, you had to then march around the desert for 40 years until all you died and your kids could get in. I still held that covenant true and let you in. I still loved you. Though you might mess up, though, yeah, look, they got into the promised land. Things were great. And guess what? The Jewish people still fell. They still were stupid. Many of us in here, we're going to hear messages at churches for years and years and years. We're still going to be out there and be a jerk to our neighbor. We're still going to be stupid about how we handle things. We're still going to say, I trust God, but we're still going to do those things. But guess what? He is still there saying, I still love you. And when you start to step back and you can recognize those things, and when you do make a mistake, you simply say, God, I am sorry. I am sorry that happened. I am sorry I got to that point. I see and I recognize who you are and what your calling in my life is. Even though I don't agree with it and I don't like it, and like in Pastor Bill's thing, he says, God, I don't want to go to go overseas, and I don't want to go to Africa. Those were the two, right, John?
He didn't want to go overseas, and he didn't want to build a church.
And guess what he did? He built a church and he went overseas on a regular basis. Here's a unique idea. How about we stop telling God what we won't do for him and just simply say, God, whatever you want. Whatever you want. Because what I was doing was butting heads with you. But when I aligned myself with you and I did what you've called me to do, it was good. Was it still hard? Yeah, it's still hard. Following Christ as a pastor is still hard. This ain't easy. It's not fun a lot of times. A lot of times you realize you got to apologize quite a bit because you make stupid decisions and you make bad calls and you make bad judgments. But I wouldn't change it for the world. I wouldn't say, God, don't use me. That's stupid. That's ludicrous. We need to see just how good God was for us. And when we realize that, we walk with him, and it's not hard. Because we realize what the other side could be.